Okay, so now that we got this set up like this, remember this wire is going to go to the battery contact, which is located in this area. So we're going to push it through this little area right here. We're not going to wire it up yet. We're going to save it for later, but we will come back to that. So that can stay just about in that section. And now we're ready to move on, I think, to the next step. And before you do that, just make sure all your wires aren't really bunched up. Kind of pulling opposite ends here, because I saw those wires were starting to get bunched up there. Okay, now the next part that we're going to do, you can either do one or two things. It's not super specific which direction we go in, but I'm going to do the speaker wires next. So before we get going, this is something that we can prep in advance. So we're going to wire up our speaker. When you're wiring up speakers, you don't need a lot of solder on there. Some of them may even have the solder already present, and you don't want to hold it on for too long either. But all you're going to do is just very quickly and briefly apply new solder. I'm going to make my wires. I'm going to use a blue 30 gauge wire. I'm going to make it extra long just because. And you need one for each side, 2 wires in total. All right, so stripping wire, it's pretty easy. So what the pliers are for, they come in handy. With one side, you grip it, and the other side, strip it, just like that. Now I like to pre-tin just about every wire that I can, so using your flux, and then this is just a little piece of heat shrink that I have some flux buried in there. Just gonna put a little bit on the end. Just makes this a lot easier. Hold that for a sec, and we're done with that side. All right, gonna come back to this wire. Grip, strip, a little bit more. So notice I'm not stripping an insane amount of wire off. Just a couple millimeters, 2 or 3 millimeters is plenty. Kind of a rule of thumb is however much space is available on the pad that you're soldering to, that's about how much wire you want to expose. What you don't want to see is the wire soldered to your pad and then extra wire sticking out that is not soldered to the pad. And by wire, I mean stripped wire. Okay, I'm gonna brush that to the side now. Now you have 2 holes here, one for each wire. So we're just gonna pass one through at a time. And this is better to just pass it through here, get it going, take the other wire, pass it through here, and that one actually went all the way through, which is great. Saved me some trouble. Let's actually see if we can do that with the other wire. Yep, looks like it went through. So this is going to be one of those exceptions to what I was saying earlier about not wanting to cross over wires in this section, just because it's only going to be a single wire and it's small. Because if you look at the way this board is going to be laid out, when you wire everything up, your speaker pads are up here on this side. So ideally you'd want them both here on the bottom, which you can do. With this wire, you could back it out and try and fish it through the other way, which I've done on another build, but it is can get a little tricky, just trying to kind of wrestle with that wire. But then that is ideally how it would look before we start gluing things in place. So now that we are kind of getting to that point, we're going to actually glue this speaker in. Now there's a couple different types of glue you can use. There is E6000, there is super glue, there are others, I'm sure. Depending on the application, for this we're just going to use some Gorilla super glue. E6000 is much better. Just going to kind of preface that now. E6000 is what you should be using for everything. If you're in a rush, and I don't want to say rush because you should never be rushed when you're installing. If you want something that's going to cure faster, just use a very small amount of this. Really, because you just don't, it's a little bit messy if you're not careful, and it also can kind of cloud up a little bit, which is not super pretty. So I'm just going to put a little bit on one side of each. Actually, let me put a little bit up here. And I'm not globbing it on. So we're just going to kind of let that sit for just a sec. And while we're waiting for that, what we can kind of start doing is we'll prep and pre-tin this kill switch. So if you remember, this middle leg is going to return to the soundboard, and one of these outer legs, and only one, is for the battery negative. So since I'm not going to use both, I'm going to go ahead and cut one of these off. So now we only have two, and I'm also going to just trim this just a bit. Definitely, you don't have to trim that down. I do it just because I'm comfortable doing it. Saves a little bit of space. And make sure that is in view. I'm actually going to, no, I'm going to leave it as is. Normally when I'm installing, I usually have this down like right here, but I don't think, yeah, you can't really see that very well on camera. So a little bit out of place here in my camera placement, but that's okay. I'll go ahead and pre-tin this. Okay, got this pre-tinned. Set that to the side. I'm gonna grab a little piece of heat shrink here. We're gonna use that for some wire here in a bit. And now let's check back in on our speaker. Speaker seems to be holding in place well. That's great. Okay, so now actually before we tackle the kill switch, I'm going to move on to the battery positive. Now, as far as the proper steps, because as of right now, we've done the speaker wires, kill switch wires, and now we're going to do the battery. If I would have done some of these in a different order, for example, if I would have done the battery contact first, and then maybe done the kill switch, but it's much easier just to get your wires pass through the channels that they need to go to when you can insert the wires from both ends. And going in from that way is much easier than having to flip it around and try and fish those wires in that way, if that makes any sense. So that's why it is sort of important to figure out which steps you're going to do first in terms of how easy it is to pass these wires through their proper channels. Because that really is going to be the most challenging part, is wire management. Soldering wires to these components is not super difficult, but getting some of these bigger wires, like these size 22 wires, can be a challenge in tight spaces. So going back to the next step, soldering wires onto the battery positive. So I'm going to use 2 wires here. I'm going to use a 22 red and a 28 red. And I'm using 2 wires for a very specific reason. And I'll explain that here in just a sec. But first, let's go ahead and get some solder on this. There we go. And that was pretty quick. This is actually probably gonna be pretty hot. Okay. All right, so we're gonna use 2 wires and we're gonna splice these together and solder them on at the same time to that. So roll out your wire. Go ahead and make it a little bit longer. Do the same thing with the 28. Okay, so why did I do 2 wires here? So one of these wires is going to go from the battery contact, battery positive, all the way to the neopixel connector, because you need the full power, full 10 amps, and not really 10 amps. It's at maximum you're running about 8, but you need your battery supplying as much power as possible directly to essentially the blade. The soundboard wire, which is going to be this 28, you don't need 10 amps from your battery to power the soundboard. So it doesn't make sense. You can save yourself some trouble, save yourself some wiring space. You don't need to add another large wire going from your battery positive to the board, only to the neopixel connector, or whatever's going to connect to the blade. So that's why there's 2 wires here. And I see people do that a lot, and it's a kind of a misconception. It's okay, it's not hurting anything, it's just a little unnecessary. You only need the 22 gauge wire, or equivalent, whatever your neopixel requirements are. You only need that going from the battery to the blade. The soundboard, at least on the positive end, does not need as big of a wire. So we're actually going to pass these through the channels first. Now remembering that we're picking the best side to pass the wires through, the pad on the board that goes to the positive is on this side. I actually grabbed the wrong wire there. So we're going to pass the size 28 wire through this channel. And we should see that pop up down there. See if I can grab it. There we go. And I only need to pull it to about right there. And now for this wire, let's go ahead and let's see, which one do we want to pick? Let's go through this side, because this is actually going to go to the rotary chassis connector. Okay, so we see that popping out down there. Kind of fish it out. Nope. And these tweezers just not doing me any favors today. Okay, and that is why we have pliers. There we go. Got it. Okay. I'm going to pull these out just so I have plenty of room to grab them and strip them, but they will be getting pulled back more that way. But just give yourself plenty of space. You can see you have lots of wire to work with here. We're going to strip this back a little bit longer than we normally would because we are going to splice these wires together. And I will even sort of over exaggerate how much I would normally cut just so you can kind of see. Okay. Now ideally when you splice wires it's easier if they're the same gauge, but that's not the case here. But the concept is still the same. So when you're splicing two wires together, you want to line them up until they're about even with the cut marks or whatever is stripped. You're basically going to twist. You're going to make it into a braid, which is not super easy because again they are different sizes, and one will tend to wrap around the other instead of them wrapping up together. So it's not really perfect when you're doing two varied sizes like this, but as long as they're making contact, you're going to take your flux, dip it around both, and then take your solder, and you're going to solder this together, holding it with one hand. There you go. And you just made a wire splice. You can go ahead and trim some of the excess there. Now, going back to our battery contact. Come on, helping hands, work with me. Help me. Okay. Now let's go ahead and solder this on. Let's try to be quick about it. There you go. All right, so you have two wires now soldered to that battery contact. Now, as you put this in place, you're going to kind of pull both wires. Try to pull a little bit at a time. Slide that in, keep pulling. And then don't necessarily press down on this with your bare finger because it might be a little bit sharp. So you can use your pliers, press it down a little bit more. And almost make sure you don't have any exposed metal. So just keep pressing that in until it goes down past the outer surface of the chassis. And that part is done. So that is complete. Now we can tackle the kill switch, because we're getting close to that point. So you have your wires still sticking out here. You don't necessarily need to tuck them in just yet. You can leave them as is. Give yourself plenty of room. Start stripping things down. Grip. Strip. Grip and strip. There we go. Two exposed leads. Put a little bit of flux on there. Pre-tin. Now, next step, don't forget, this is usually part that people do backwards or not at all. Get some heat shrink. Cut a little piece off for each leg, This is more of just like a good habit than something that's going to make or break your install. It's not going to make or break your install, but it's just kind of nice to see it on there. It's a good idea to do it. Just keeps things rather clean. Okay. Now you can remember which wire goes where. I'll give you bonus points, but if you don't remember, I'll just tell you. So this middle leg is going to be for the soundboard negative, which is your white wire. The outer leg is going to be your battery negative, which is the black wire. So let's do the black wire first. Okay. Okay, that one's done. And let's do the white wire. Oop. Let me hold that a different way. There we go. Okay. So there we go. Kill switch is done. And take your heat shrink, slide it on over. You can either use your soldering iron or, in this case, a heat gun, quickly to shrink that on. There we go. All right. So now we can go ahead and push this through. Probably you will need to pull these wires as you push. And don't forget you have another wire right here. So go ahead and pull those. Actually, you can probably pull them both at the same time. Keep going. There we go. It's a better option. And this is durable wire, so even with all this pulling and tugging, as long as your soldering joints are solid and you're using good wire, then you don't have to really worry about stuff coming undone. Okay, so just about everything is buttoned up down here. You can see it looks nice and tidy. And really, you don't even need to glue this part in. It'll hold itself in place through the resistive force of these thicker wires. So for now, we're going to go ahead and put this black wire back through. Put that where it needs to go. All right, and next, we're going to add some wires here and actually start soldering onto the board some of the wires that we're going to need to go to the flat side of the Rotary Chassis PCB. So I guess one thing we can do while we're here, we can just pre-tin these. This is not necessarily in order, but we're just going to do it. There we go. Got all those pads pre-tinned. All right, now we're going to start prepping the soundboard. And this is where I said I recommend you heat shrink these. I'm going to put this on a spot where I know I'm not going to solder to, and it's not going to damage any components. An example of a bad spot to clamp down would be basically anything like these components here. Don't clamp on those. I'm just going to be clamping onto the outside of some of these pads, which I'm not going to be using. And for your layout, just refer to your manual, but I already know what I'm soldering to here. So I'm going to have data, ground, we have positive, negative, LED 1, switch 1, LED 2, 3, switch 2, your 2 speaker pads. Then also what you're going to want to do for Profi you want to bridge LED pads 2 and 3. We'll just solder it there. Do that again. There we go. Took me 3 tries, but I got it. So you can see its bridge right there. Okay. Now for the next step, and still don't worry about these wires. If you want, you can pass one of these wires through. This is going to be your positive, and you'll need that to connect to the Rotary Chassis PCB. Let's go ahead and pull that through so it's out of the way. So we will need a 30 green. You'll need a white 30, a 30 gray, a 30 black, 24 white, and what am I missing? What am I missing? I think that's it. Let me get those out of the picture here for a second. But there are 5 different wires you're going to need. They don't have to be those exact colors. And you can use larger if you want for some of those. But always use as small of wire as you need just to save yourself on space. Okay, so we're going to cut some wire off here. We're going to solder some things, start soldering things to the board. So we're going to use this wire for data. We're going to use this wire, the black 30, for the common ground. This will be shared between both switches. We're going to cut some 24 white. This is going to be for the NeoPixel negative. And we're going to do 2 of these. So 2 24s. Let's cut a little bit of 30 gray. I'm going to use this for my secondary switch or auxiliary. And I think that's it. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do, we're going to start soldering to the board. Now, before I begin here, remember this chassis build is not going to be the same set of rules for all chassis builds or installs. Sometimes what you'll do is you'll wire all your components from the outside and work your way in and finish at the board. And you could technically do that for this as well. But for this one, I am going to find it a little bit easier if I wire everything at the board first and then finish at this end. And the reason why is because when I get to this spot where everything's wired to the board and I have it put in place, I will have this extra wire sticking out and I will be able to pull all the slack out, pull it straight. It's nice and clean. Because if I were to do everything at the board last, I'd probably have some excess wire sticking out and I'd have to tuck it in and it might be a mess, but it'll come out very clean this way. But this is not the only way to do it. I just want you to know that it's not the only way that you have to do this, but this is my recommendation only. So starting with the green wire, I'm going to cut a little bit off and strip, and that is going to the data line 1, going through the hole. Next is the common ground wire. Grip and strip. Through the hole again. Okay. Now when I